All right, everybody, good morning and welcome back to the KSR YouTube channel. It's another day in the shop. You saw the thumbnail. We are working on Vice Grip Garage Derek's Independence Chevelle today. So he's been really busy with his Monte Carlo and all kinds of other stuff. And a couple months ago, we had talked about some touch-up things we wanted to finish on this thing from the last time it was here. We got a flex fuel sensor to wire in and a few other odds and ends. We need to finish his door bars so that he will be legal to go as fast as 10 flat. But definitely got a lot of stuff to do on the thing. We've already kind of started on some stuff, and this one might be a little sad for some people, but when the parts showed up, we just started installing them. So this came in, I guess about 24 hours ago, and got a little bit of work done on it yesterday. One of the first things we did, we took off the awesome, cool steering wheel. Yeah, we took off the wheel. Well, the reason being, oops, we got to add a trans brake button to the steering wheel, and Derek got him a sweet MPI wheel from Motion Raceworks and a quick disconnect steering wheel, so it'll be a little bit easier for him to get in and out of the car once the door bar is installed in the car. But definitely got a lot of work to do. Got to change the torque converter. We've got a whole crate of suspension stuff. Whew, we got a lot of work to do. So let's get to work. All right, well, while you're here on the channel, please give us a like and a subscribe, a comment down there in the comment section, and share it around with your buddies. You know, we like to think we're doing some pretty fun stuff here in the shop. A lot of it is thrashing. Some of it hasn't gotten on camera lately, I'll admit, because we've been super busy getting ready for sick week. But we are cranking out some work. So when we've got a big deadline approaching, sometimes it means that I don't film quite as much as I would like to. But trying to do a better job of filming everything that's going on here in the shop. If you want any KSR merch, go to winwithksr.com. So we're gonna get the transmission out of this thing, get the torque converter swapped. That'll be our first order of business, and then see what else we can get done before the weekend. All right, well, I did a little cold start logging. Actually logged it when we backed it out of the shop and also when we pulled it back in. Derek had said it was a little long to crank when it was up at his place and 40 degrees up in Tennessee, which we don't get a lot of days where it's 40 degrees down here in Florida, obviously. Well, today was one of those days, so got a good log on that. I think I'm gonna see a couple areas I can make some tweaks. Once it gets to like 80 degrees of coolant temp, crank's perfect. It's almost like it was tuned for that. It's weird, I know. But first thing we're gonna do is swap the torque converter, because if you guys remember from when we had it on the dyno, torque converter was way too loose. So got a torque converter to swap, and we may install some of the suspension stuff, but we're gonna try and get it to the track Saturday so that Derek can get a shakedown in it with the new converter. Definitely got a lot to do. Might do some suspension stuff while I've got it up in the air. Guess we'll find out. Let's get to it. Well, the first thing in this video, or this time lapse, we're gonna jump off into is pulling the transmission out to swap the torque converter. And you can see we've got to undo the safety blanket that's on the transmission. You know, a guy sometimes likes to stay protected from his transmission were it to explode and try to come through the floor. So a nice Kevlar blanket does a good job there to help prevent transmission pieces from coming into the interior of the car. But that same safety device can make it quite a bit more challenging to get the transmission out of the car. In the case with this transmission, the upper two mounts where the safety blanket attaches to the transmission to hold it forward in the car proved to be quite the challenge because it was kind of blocking the bolts, which we really haven't gotten to that part yet in the video. We're draining the pan now. But basically the straps and their tabs made it a little bit of an extra challenge to get the upper transmission bolts out. And yeah, it took us a little bit of time. Typically we can knock one of these transmissions out of an older muscle car in about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how complex it is or how much the exhaust is in the way. But this one took a tad longer because it was a bit of a fight to get some of the bolts out. But, you know, not too big of a deal. We managed to get her out, which you'll see here in just a second. We do have one more challenge right at the end with the ears on the side of the transmission, like on the bell housing area, being too wide to fit between the header. So we break out the old Sawzall here in just a second and slice those puppies off so you don't have to worry about taking the exhaust loose to get the transmission out, which will be a nice feature if the car ever needs to be worked on in a hurry, like on a sick week. So transmission is out. We're going to get to swapping the other torque converter back in. We cleaned up our cut marks and away we go. All right, well, you can hear the jack in the background. We got the new Circle D billet torque converter installed. That's just party, isn't it? It's just party. So hopefully have it back up and going here. We got our dimensions for the pull forward. Once we get it up in there to make sure we get that all shimmed right. This easier to get the trans lines on. Maybe while before we go all the way up in there. Yep. Okay. And if you saw in the time lapse, yeah, we sliced the ears off so that way we didn't have to pull the headers loose. Derek left us a nice little message. Thanks Kevin and team on the transmission pan, which actually we're gonna be ripping that pan off because we're gonna add a deep transmission pan and we're gonna add a temperature sender somewhere on it so that we can put his transmission temperature on the dash. With the Holly, we'll just wire it in as one more input, drop it onto the dash. It's that simple. I love Holly fuel injection. It's just great. So get back to work on getting this thing put back in, and then we'll see you guys back in a minute. All right, so time lapse number 2 for this video, working on the Independence Chevelle. Starts out kind of just the reverse of what we did in the last time lapse with taking the transmission out. And now we're putting it back in. So right now Drew's working on hooking back up the transmission lines because they were a little easier to connect before the transmission was shoved all the way up in there. This is actually Ralph in the video that owns the really pretty 69 Chevelle that we did the roll bar and the engine for and the suspension work on. He came by to make an appointment to get his car back up on the dyno after he made some exhaust changes to the car, and came out into the shop and hung out with us for a little bit, checking out another big block A body similar to his El Camino. I think I called it a Chevelle earlier in the commentary here, but the really pretty copper colored El Camino is Ralph's, and Drew and I are now both kind of fighting those upper bolts that were a problem. You see Ralph even tries to lend a hand getting his arms up in there to get the bolts started. Took us a little bit of a trick to be able to get all the way up in there and get the straps held back in by the bolts. Not gonna lie, we had a little bit of fight there, but we managed to get everything back up installed there, and you can see we've got the diaper still hanging off of the transmission, or the explosion blanket. And the big reason for that is we've got to put this other transmission pan on it, which now has a temperature sender in it, so that Derek will be able to keep an eye on the transmission temps while he's driving down the road and racing the car. But we also have to wire in the trans brake, and that wiring is going to tuck inside of the explosion blanket, and then the wires will come together and they will go up inside the car where the shifter cable goes up and through. Then we'll just route the wiring down the transmission tunnel over to the ECU, where we also have a Holley solid state driver that will control the trans brake right from the ECU. So we will just have the steering wheel button wired as an input into the Holley, and then the Holley can tell the trans brake when to activate. And eventually what we will do is add a speed sensor to the car so that the trans brake will only work, say, below say 10 miles an hour, so that it can't be bumped while Derek's driving down the road, or if the wire gets mashed all of a sudden, say the coiled cord gets wrapped up in the steering wheel and the two wires connect each other and it tries to apply the trans brake. Well, if we wire in a speed sensor, it will at least make it to where it won't lock up the trans brake unless we're going below a certain mile per hour. And that's just a nice safety feature to keep you from having a problem, even potentially crashing the car. If you accidentally hit the trans brake button while you're cruising at 50, 60 miles an hour and it locks up the tires, you're in for a problem. So you might be wondering what I'm doing now. I am actually drilling the holes in the flex plate to be one size larger than 7/16, because when I went to install the torque converter bolts to the flex plate, seemed to be just a slight bit of misalignment there to where the holes didn't perfectly line up, whether it was the flex plate or the torque converter. I would tend to believe it was probably the flex plate that just wasn't quite machined properly. So I end up drilling the holes slightly bigger to give the bolts just a little bit of wiggle room so they align up in the torque converter. Just you can thread them in by hand now. So we also verified that the torque converter spacing was right, and basically what we do with that is we push the converter all the way into the transmission, measure the gap between the bolts, the pads for the bolts, and the flex plate itself. You should have between 125 thousandths and 187 thousandths, which that's basically an 1/8 inch and 3/16 of an inch. So you can take those two drill bits. You want an 1/8 inch drill bit to go in, but a 3/16 drill bit to not go in, and that's the easy way to set your spacing. And then you pull the torque converter up against the flex plate, which gives the torque converter the right amount of engagement into the pump. If you bottom it out in there and shim it all up, you will destroy the pump in the transmission. I've had some people do that. So some different transmissions along the way, and they bring us a car, we just put this transmission in, and it's broke because they jammed it all the way in there and didn't know any better. I mean, I did it myself when I first started working on cars, and it's just one of those deals where a lesson learned along the way, and hopefully that's something that helps you guys out. So back to the transmission install on Vice Grip's car. You can see Drew tightening up the new transmission pan right now, and a second ago you might have seen me grinding on the shifter cable bracket, because with the cast aluminum pan being a lot thicker than the stamped steel pan was, well, now we had an interference problem with the shifter cable bracket. Seems like you make one change, you got to make another couple of changes to make everything work. Right now I'm double checking the shifter adjustment. I've got Drew up in the car and he's clicking the shifter through each gear, and I'm verifying that the transmission is in fact correctly going into the gear that we are selecting on the shifter. It's always a good thing to do. Make sure that there's no binding there, because if you get a transmission set up wrong on the shifter cable, you can end up burning the transmission up in very short order, and we don't want to do that to Vice Grip's car. He's got a long week of driving this thing on sick week all through Florida and into South Georgia. Hope to be right there alongside of him and Soccer Mom, and with Sean's car and the Chevy too. But we've got lots and lots and lots of other little things to do on this car. Kind of giving it a look over now, making sure that the wiring is tucked up. Kind of felt like we could improve the wiring and the fuel line routing a little bit. So we take a little bit of time to more securely attach the electrical wiring and the fuel lines that are routing down the car, down by the exhaust and everything. Just felt like we could make some improvements there to give the car some better longevity. Another thing I saw was that the mufflers and the exhaust was hanging only by the headers, and on a long drive, that's going to loosen up. It's going to possibly crack the headers, you know, with the weight of the exhaust bouncing off the headers. So we decided to add a couple of exhaust hangers, weld some bolts to the floor here, and then we've got a hanger that's going to come down and weld to the tailpipe of the muffler itself. Drew's going to go down and make sure all of the electronics are unplugged, because anytime before you weld on a car, you should unhook all of the electronics, especially if you have any kind of aftermarket electronics in the car or it's fuel injected. Even your factory computers, you know, when you're welding on a car, you can send some weird electronic signals through the chassis. So the best way to avoid that going into your ECU is just to unplug them. Get rid of them completely. No chance of them possibly getting any kind of interference and getting damaged. So you can see Drew welding the bolts onto the bottom of the floor now. There's actually a nice brace that goes under the floor that was thicker material, and just welding it to the sheet metal floor pan. So it's going to be a good sturdy mount that should not come loose, and it won't be something that Derek will be driving down the road and drive over his exhaust. Might make for some good video, but not so much on being able to enjoy the week. When we try to do events like Sick Week and stuff, our goal is to not have to work on the car. Another little thing we thought we could fix while we had the car was the hood right here where Drew is welding on both sides was cracking. So we made a little brace to go over the crack, a little piece of flat steel, and supported the hood on each side of the crack, as well as tried to weld up the crack as best as we could. So you can see Drew covered the engine up with a blanket to try and make sure we didn't get any spots on it. Well, he kind of caught it on fire. Thankfully, CJ was watching him from his work area, and they caught it before it got out of control. All right, so lots and lots of work going on. Ended up with a little bit more time lapse in this video than I thought, just because we were crashing on everything else. Well, we made some brackets here for the hood because the hood was bowing and bending. Now that's nice and closes nice. Doesn't bend here like it was doing before. Maybe we need just a tweak more adjusting on that. Huh, there it went. But we got some of our wiring stuff done. Definitely got a good bit of work still to go on this thing. Turns out, once we went to move it this morning, the battery switch quit working. So I kind of just hooked the battery cable to the other side to get it to crank up. And we pulled it in the shop. Now we're switching to a different cutoff switch, which by the looks of it, Drew's done with that. Sweet. Well, that's exciting. Guess we can crank it up and check transmission fluid, huh? All right. We'll save that for tomorrow's video. Bring you guys back for another one. Anyways, appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. See you guys next time.